Welcome to the Capital News. I am your host, Alex Christ. Today is April 9th, 2019. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope everyone is doing well out there. So let's get straight to the market news. The S&P was down 17.5 points. The Dow was down 190. The NASDAQ closed down 45 points. And the Russell 2000, the small cap index, closed down 19 points for the day, equating to a decline of 1.22 percentage points. So all markets were down for the day. Oil remains at $64 a barrel. Gold is at $1,306 an ounce. And silver is currently at $15.15 an ounce. Meanwhile, the 10-year Treasury bond declined, now sits at 2.499%. The VIX increased 8.35% and now sits at $14.28. So, why the down day? Well, some can say, well, it was just a necessary pullback, just a little mini correction, ebbs and flows of the market. Others might say it was headline driven. Well, what were some of the headlines that came out today that might have moved this market to the downside? Well, we had a couple things. We had President Trump now out there talking about levying $11 billion worth of tariffs on the European Union in response basically because the EU has been subsidizing Airbus, which is the European counterpart to our Boeing. They make airplanes and all that stuff. Well, they said, well, it adversely affected American jobs in the American economy. So we're going to levy $11 billion of tariffs on the EU. Food, wine, mechanical parts, airline parts, whole host of things. I think ultimately it's more or less just a distraction. I mean, we're talking about $250 billion worth of goods, of Chinese goods in the U.S.-China trade war. Now we're talking about $11 billion in the U.S.-EU trade war now. I mean, you can fight two battles on different fronts. I mean, it can be done. Ironically, it's kind of what was World War II, right? We were in the Asian theater and we were in the European theater. Now that's exactly where we are. Now, why do I call this somewhat of a distraction? Well, because the U.S.-China trade talks are not going as well as we had been told they were. We were supposed to have a signing agreement a few weeks ago, didn't happen. Supposed to have a signing agreement a couple weeks ago, didn't happen. Now we're talking about, from the president himself saying, well, we're going to give it 4 weeks and we'll know if we're going to have a deal or not. That was last week. So we got another month ahead of us here to see if there's ever going to be a real deal. And if there is, don't forget the Chinese have until 2025 to comply. 2025 to comply. The president, even if he wins re-election in 2020, will not be the president in 2025. So what does this mean? Is this just a game? Thought this was supposed to be the master of the deal. Thought this was supposed to be the biggest deal ever. Now you have another trade war going on with the Europeans. Well, is that going to be the best deal ever? Which one's it going to be? Or is this just going to be economic and political chaos for the next couple years, for the next 4 years? What's going to happen? I don't know. But you got to pay attention to it. The markets didn't like these tariffs, so the market sold off. We also had news from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the IMF cut its outlook for global growth to the lowest since the financial crisis amid a bleaker outlook in most major advanced economies. Well, aren't these people geniuses? We've been talking about this for months, okay? This is, I think, the second or third time already this year or within the past few months here that they've lowered their forecast because it now sits at 3.3%. It was at 3.5% back in January. So the IMF is now, obviously getting real with it. They're starting to see everything. Not as good as what we're told, right? I mean, that's just how it works. It's just how it works. Politicians don't want to take the blame. Don't care who you are, where you are. Politicians don't want to take the blame. Central bankers don't want to take the blame. Major corporations who are joined at the hip with these central banks and these governments don't want to take the blame. These people do not want to witness another scenario like 2008, 2009. And quite honestly, if you follow this podcast, I think it's going to be worse than that. Now, we're told that type of event, that type of financial crisis only happens once in a lifetime. Once every 80 years, once every 100 years type of thing. Well, if you have another one that happens within 10 years, you got a big problem. Hey, I was only supposed to see one of these in my lifetime, if that. Now I got two? Oh, heads are going to roll. And that might be quite literally. I mean, don't like to say it, but if you have that type of situation, that type of pandemonium, that type of chaos, the world over, I mean, things could get pretty ugly pretty quickly. So you got the EU tariffs, you got the U.S.-China trade talks continuing. Nothing there yet, and what we know isn't good. And now you have the IMF cutting world global growth. Okay? So that's where we are. The market's sold off. All right, that at least makes sense. That's almost the first time in quite a while where these markets actually looked at the news out there and said, oh my goodness, and they actually sold off. Because most of the news that we're getting is bad. Yet these markets continue to climb ever higher. Finally, you have news, real news, and the markets sell off accordingly. We'll see what happens. Don't forget, we are in the midst now of the end of the first quarter of 2019, so companies will be coming out and reporting their earnings. And recall, because we've had this discussion here before, stock buybacks have been a major driver of growth in this stock market for the past few years. Okay? We are now in a blackout period because corporations are not allowed to buy their stock back during earnings season because it looks like there could be some funny business, some insider trading stuff going on. So they're not allowed to buy back their stocks. That's been the primary driver going here. Okay? So it's going to be interesting to see who fills that void, if anybody fills that void. If somebody fills the void, it'll be central banks. That's who it'll be. So if we rocket ever higher, it's going to be because there has been more liquidity injected into the system. Not necessarily by the Federal Reserve, but maybe from the Bank of Japan or the Swiss National Bank or the ECB or a plethora of others. Okay? So just be on the lookout for that. Now, briefly yesterday I talked about Ray Dalio. Again, Ray Dalio is the founder of Bridgewater Associates, the largest hedge fund in the world. I believe $160 billion in assets under management. He recently drafted an article that has been posted to LinkedIn and also to his website. Just Google Ray Dalio LinkedIn article. It'll come up. You can find it. It's lengthy. It's in a couple parts. I haven't made my way through the whole thing yet. I was working on some other things, but I got through some of it. And from what I heard from some of his interviews, because he was on CBS's 60 Minutes on Sunday, he was on CNBC the other day, talking about the article and how he views capitalism and how he is arguing that it needs to be reformed. Okay? So, giving him the benefit of the doubt, I mean, he's highly successful, one of the wealthiest men in the world. When he talks, I listen. Doesn't mean I agree with everything he says, but there's only a few people out there when they give interviews or they give speeches do I pay attention to. He's one of them. Okay? Now, given his interviews and what he said on 60 Minutes and CNBC, talking about capitalism needing reform, I said, well, what kind of definition is he working from here, talking about capitalism being reformed? Because I don't believe capitalism needs reformed. Capitalism, and more importantly, and this is a big distinction, free market capitalism needs reinstated. So here we have billionaire hedge fund manager Ray Dalio saying capitalism needs reformed, and here you have me and my argument saying, no, free market capitalism needs to be reinstated. It's a big difference there, okay? Now, giving Mr. Dalio the benefit of the doubt, not having read the whole article, especially I listened to his interviews before I started reading the article, I was, giving him the benefit of the doubt of, well, what is his definition of capitalism? Well, once I read the article up to that point, I agree with his definition of capitalism. So we're not off on that, because definitions are an important thing. A lot of times it's taken for granted. But that's where a lot of miscommunication comes from, because everybody thinks, well, I have a definition of this, and I have a definition of that, and he has a definition of this, and she has a definition of that. And that's how everybody gets disjointed. And everybody thinks they're talking about the same thing when they're not. Well, I thought it meant this. So he gives a definition of capitalism, which I agree with. That's what it is, okay? That's fine. In our book, The Cynic's Guide to Investing, we kickstarted the book with definitions so that you, the reader, understood where we were coming from, because free market capitalism was pretty much the theme throughout the book's entirety. So if you didn't understand our definition, which is the correct definition, by the way, of free market capitalism, you weren't going to understand the rest of it. So you had to be on the same page, okay? So this is where I think, at least from where I am in the article, Mr. Dalio falls short. He just calls it capitalism. You got to go further. You have to talk about free market capitalism, because capitalism, just by definition, is money. You go out, you earn a wage, you save that money, you put that money into savings and investment, and it's used. That's the capital, okay? That's pretty straightforward. That's how he defines it because that's what it is. We're on the same page. But you have that in other systems. You have people out there making a wage that are capable of saving money that can be saved and invested. You can have that under a socialist regime. You can have that under a fascist regime. You can have that under a communist regime and all the likes, okay? That's what you have. So if you're going to have capitalism, you need to broaden it. You have to talk about free market capitalism, all right? It's an important distinction because when you go through the first part of the article, he broke it down into two parts because it is a lengthy article. He has very descriptive statistics. This is what he does. He is a macro global hedge fund, basically, is how you look at it, is how he would, I think, define himself. He looks at the world at large, and he breaks things down. He looks at historical trends. He's not trying to be a day trader getting in and out of trades all day long. He has people who are looking at economic history, financial history, trying to find trends, trying to see if this type of situation existed in the past. What does it mean today? What's different? What's the same? And then he makes his investment decisions accordingly. Okay, and it works well for him and his team. Obviously, $160 billion in assets under management. Okay, and he's been around for a long time. So he has something that is working for him and his team. All right, kudos to him and his team for being successful. However, when you look at the article, and some of the things that he kicks off starting to talk about is education and the wealth gap and the income gap that exists. Okay? He starts to identify these problems, but then his solutions will get into the second part of the article. But even from reading just the first part so far, he is failing to understand that these problems have been caused not by a failure of free market capitalism, but because of the injection of ever-increasing government. Ever-increasing government largesse, whether that is the fascism, corporatism we talk about on this program, or the socialism that exists, because they're one and the same. They're just different names. They got a kind of a different taste to it, but they're both spices, okay? They're both spices. One's just a little hotter than the other. That's all it is. It gives a little bit of a different flavor, but it's all in the same boat. It's all in the same category. Communism, fascism, socialism, all the same thing at the end of the day, okay, folks? It is. So he's basically saying capitalism needs reformed. So therefore, he's making the argument that capitalism is failing on these fronts because you have income gaps that are terrible, you have wealth gaps that are terrible, and you have education results that are terrible. I'm not going to dispute this, not for a second. The problem is he's saying this is a result of failed capitalism and it needs reformed. It doesn't need reform. Free market capitalism needs reinstated. Okay? Who takes ownership of all of this education? The federal government does. The government does. They say, let's just standardize it. Let's just do this, that, and the other. And what has happened? You see poorer and poorer results as a consequence. You see more kids dropping out of school. You see more kids disengaged. You see test scores going down the toilet. You have a lot of students not being able to read, write, and do basic math at their grade level. So, I mean, this is failure after failure. Then, ironically, in his own writing, in his own article, Ray Dalio talks about how much better private schools are than a lot of public schools. Well, Mr. Dalio, I have to point this out to you, but that's a free market capitalistic solution. So there's no surprise that the free market capitalistic solution is better than the government solution. Okay? In this example of private schools, these private schools, these institutions have said, you know what, we've identified a problem. We think we have a better way to fix it. And then they come up and they do fix it and they have better results. They have more students who graduate. They have more students who are reading and writing and doing mathematics at their grade level, or they're ahead of the curve. They have better test scores. They're more likely to get into college. They're more likely to do better, yada, yada, yada. That's free market capitalism doing its job. What Mr. Dalio is complaining about is too much government. And ironically, when asked the question on these interviews on CBS, and I believe CNBC as well, he was asked, well, would you mind if the government taxed you more? No, not at all. I invite it. I want them to tax me more. Well, Mr. Dalio, I believe you're still in good health. I hope you are. And I'm pretty sure you know how to write. And I'm sure your hand works. So get your checkbook out and send Uncle Sam a check. Don't tell everybody else to pay more money. If they want to, they can do the same thing. Taxes doesn't have to be by force. You can send Uncle Sam a check for more money. He will take it. I guarantee it. So it's ironic when you go through this and you read this, and I'm going to put an answer out on the Capital News, and it will be posted on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn as well, and obviously on the capitalnews.com. But I'm going to answer Mr. Dalio's writing here, his question, his statement that capitalism needs reformed, because it doesn't need reformed. It needs reinstated. It needs reinstated. We have put too much trust into our government, into our politicians at every level, federal, state, local. Too much, because he goes into it and he says, well, look, most people back in the day, back in the 70s and 80s, most people expected their children to do better than themselves. Most of those children expected to do better than their parents. Now it's a 180. It's the other way around. That's not good. That's not a great economic miracle. Okay? It's not. Now, the other thing that we talk about all the time here is capital does not come from a printing press. Well, what have we seen for the past decade the world over from central banks? Printing presses turned on full. Just keep it going, keep it going. I was ranting and raving yesterday with quantitative easing number 4. The president coming out and saying, yeah, go ahead and back and start printing money again. Are you kidding me? We're supposed to be in the midst of a great economic miracle, according to the president, yet he wants more money printing. All right? That ain't capitalism, ladies and gentlemen. That's fraud. That's counterfeit. If you printed money, they'd lock you up and throw away the key. But the Federal Reserve and all these other central banks can do it, and they do it at will. And who oversees them? Nobody. Nobody. Do they get called up to Congress every once in a while? Sure. Who overrules them? Nobody. Nobody. Ray Dalio is a wealthy man and has become more and more wealthy because of this money printing, as have all of the wealthy in this country. That's why he shows these statistics in his article of the rich getting richer, the wealthier getting wealthier. And then he wants to scratch his head and say capitalism needs reform. No! That printing money is not capitalism. It isn't. It's corporatism. It's nepotism. Because those people who have wealth, their assets have increased because that's what happens when you print money. This isn't difficult to understand. So I don't know if, again, I'm still giving credit to Mr. Dalio because I haven't finished the arguments, his articles, and his arguments within them. But at least so far, he's sort of at odds with himself. His own article with some of his own data contradicts himself. It's proving my point. It's proving my point. When the government comes in and says, oh, no, we'll take care of you. We'll be mommy and daddy. We'll give you a check. We'll give you free child care. We'll give you free health care. We'll give you food stamps. We'll give you income. We'll give you everything. Well, then you start to have a breakdown of the family, which, again, is something that Mr. Dalio correctly points out in his article, that there has been a breakdown of the family structure because he accredits a lot of his success to coming from a good family. And he wasn't a silver spooner. He was a middle-class American family. He was broke. He had to ask his father for a $10,000 loan to support his family. That's where he came from. He was, the new hotshot on Wall Street, and then he ended up losing it, and then he built himself back up. Again, more kudos to him. I like Mr. Dalio. Don't get me wrong. But this is wrong. And I'm not just going to, lay down and let him step over me when he brings this type of argument to the fore. No, because it's wrong. This isn't the right argument. He has a platform, Mr. Dalio does, to educate and help a lot of people, and I think that's what he wants to do in this part of his life. I think he's about 70 years old. This is what, he's made his billions. This is what he wants to do, I think. But having these definitions is vital. And so far, it's not the right one to say that it needs to be reformed. It needs to be reinstated. It needs to be reinstated. When the government gets involved, it broke up the family because it said to all of these mothers, look, power to the women. Power to the women. You can be a single mother. You can have a job. You can do it all. You can do everything a man can. And we're going to be here, mommy, daddy, government, to support you. So you don't need a man to be in the household. Well, we know from all of the stats, all of the studies, that children do better when they are raised with a mother and a father in the household, with a stable relationship. That's non-controversial. It's non-controversial. And when you have a further deterioration of the family unit breaking down, this is what you get. You see more people in poverty, and then it becomes a vicious cycle because people get addicted to it. That's the word I'm going to use because I think it's right. It's what do they want to be there? No, but how many people want to be addicted to drugs and be in that type of misery? But that's where they are, right? It's a sad thing. This is what happens when you have too much government meddling in all of these affairs. If Mr. Dalio was ringing the bell on this, it'd be a completely different story. If he was saying that capitalism, free market capitalism, needs to be reinstated, not reformed, he'd be singing my song. That's what I want to hear. But unfortunately, at this point, he's not. He's not. He's saying it needs reform. What he needs to look at is the failure of government. The failure of government to get into everybody's business, everybody's households, everybody's pockets, everybody's personal lives, everybody's business life. They got to get out of it. That's the problem. That's the problem. And he should know this because he's made money understanding what countries thrive and survive and which ones fail. This should be a no-brainer. So I am very surprised when he comes out and says it needs to be reformed. No, it needs to be reinstated because the free market system has lifted more people out of poverty than any other system in the history of this planet. People didn't leave the old country to flock to the United States in the 1800s and early 1900s because they thought they were going to be repressed here. They came here because they said, well, my goodness, there's opportunity. There's opportunity, and with hard work, I can make it. I can make a life for my family, and they can have a better life for themselves and for their families, and on it goes. But now we're at a breaking point. And this is why Mr. Dalio has this article, because we are at a breaking point, and he sees this, again, because he studies financial and economic history. And he knows perfectly well when you have this type of income gap and wealth gap that exists, that you are setting the stage for some sort of political and social chaos, maybe even a revolution. Highly possible, and it might even be more probable than just possible. So this is why he's ringing these alarm bells. But it's definitional too. So maybe you can argue, well, you're being more ideological and this, that. No, I think I'm being rather practical here because if you're going to solve a problem, you have to identify the problem accurately. And right now, as far as I can tell, Mr. Dalio has not identified it accurately. He has identified problems, but he is not diagnosing it right. He is not giving the right prescription, the right procedure to solve it. In fact, he wants to give more money to the government. The government wastes it. Give it to entrepreneurs. Give it to the free market capitalistic system. They will solve the problem because that's all they know how to do. If they don't, they go out of business. When the government messes up, do they go out of business? No. They want to tax you more. That's not how it works, and that's why we have so many problems that we do. Thank you so much for joining me today, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a pleasure having you, as always. Please like, share, subscribe, get the word out. I will most definitely continue this conversation as I make my way through Mr. Dalio's article, and be on the lookout for my response on the Capital News, on Facebook, on Twitter, and the like. And also check out the Capital News. I just posted another article on there saying, why do we fear recession? So check that out. I'd appreciate it. This is the Capital News. I am Alex Karitis. Godspeed.